Well, hello there. This is another exciting video in my astrology series. This particular series is called Unpacking the Birth Chart series, and I'm Seth Roback. Being the first video, we're answering the first question when you do an astrology chart, which is who are you? And in this video, we're going to talk about the big three and the outer four. So we're looking at how do you begin an astrology chart reading? Where do you begin? How do you prepare to do a chart? Well, you first start with your client. Ask yourself, why do they want a reading? And also get to know your client a little bit more, or kind of gear your whole reading towards them. In particular, you want to know what is their age and stage in life. How old are they? Are you doing a chart for a young child? Are you doing a chart for your elder? Are you doing it for a 20-year-old? Depending on what their age is and where they are in their life, that determines how you should deliver a chart to them. So what are the common reasons people get a reading? The number one reason I've noticed is that people are looking for love. And they are either dating in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever. They're, people are looking for a partner. So that's one of the reasons. Another one is they're looking for a career. They're young and they're developing their career, or they're changing jobs. They're not happy with the one they have, or they're wondering about pursuing a different route in their career. Often I do charts for someone who just had a baby, or for a family. They want charts for all their kids and their spouse and that sort of thing. Or sometimes you get a chart from an elder who's retired. What do they do with their retirement? What's their relationship to their family, and what is their legacy? That sort of stuff. So other kind of considerations you want to look at when doing a chart is how much they know about astrology. Are they proficient at it? Do they have no background in it at all? In which case you should take time and explain things to them. Move slowly, more slowly. Some people have a basic understanding. You can move a little quicker when you describe things in a chart. Also, you might look at that people have certain religious beliefs. They have certain cultural values. I do a lot of chart readings with idea that some of the things in the chart have to do with reincarnation, such as a south and north node. But I can adapt my reading because I don't necessarily know for a fact myself, so I can present it in different views, different points of view. So let's look at the big three. What are the big three? Why are they called the big three? And I think they're called the big three because they're the most common things that astrologers talk about, which is our sun, moon, and rising sign. Our sun sign changes every month. Our moon sign changes every 2.5 days. And our rising sign or ascendant changes every 2 hours. So really, when you talk about the sun, moon, and rising sign, it has to do with your individuality, because those are the points in a chart that change the fastest, particularly the ascendant. So it's kind of a light introduction to the personality. The sun represents our outer self, the moon our inner self, and our ascendant our physical appearance, and kind of the early upbringing that we had. So one thing you can do is look at, sometimes you get double and triple signs where you get, two signs whether the sun, the moon, or the sun, the ascendant, or the moon and the ascendant will be of a particular sign, or all three will be of a particular sign. And then that person is really defined by that sign. And also you want to look at cusps that have traits of both neighboring signs. So what are the outer four? The outer four are the farthest outer four planets, which are Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And they're slow moving, that we consider them generational markers, and that they will stay in a sign that will influence, stay in a sign long enough that it will influence a larger amount of people in that sign. So the big three are about your individual personality. The outer four are about your generational identity, about your generation. So one way to kind of look at the outer four is to be familiar with the term ingress or ingresses, which is the time a planet spends in a sign before it moves on to the next one. And then when it moves through all the signs, it's called a return. You're familiar with the Saturn return, the solar return. That's the time it takes to complete an orbit. The ingress that I look at the most is the Pluto ingress, because it's the slowest moving of the planets. And then I also look at the outer four aspects. So if you look down here, see, ingresses and returns. Saturn moves through a sign, that's its ingress, every 2.5 years, does a complete return in 28 years. So that's the famous Saturn return. We get 2 of those in a lifetime. Uranus moves through a sign every 7 years and completes a return every 84 years, which, if we're lucky, if we have good enough health, we'll be alive during our Uranus return. People often note the Uranus, transiting Uranus opposition natal Uranus, that happens around age 42, which kind of marks our midlife crisis. Neptune is in a sign every 14 years and does a complete return about every 160 years. So this occurs over multiple generations. And Pluto is in a sign every 9 to 31 years and completes a return every 250 years. So looking at Pluto ingresses and how it influences us in our generation, we first define Pluto, what sort of characteristics does it have? How does it influence us? And Pluto, being the god of the underworld, represents death and then also resurrection, rebirth. His relationship to his wife, Persephone, is about the fertility cycles of life and death that happens in nature with, winter and summer and daylight and lack of daylight and all that kind of stuff. So it has to do with transformation and regeneration. Pluto signs mark also, on a historical level, collective threats, like things we're afraid of, and then how we transform. So looking at the first, or going back to probably our great-great-grandparents, that who aren't alive, were most likely born in the Pluto and Gemini generation, which was, Pluto was in Gemini from 1882 until 1912. And from this era, you get a lot of the existential writers like Ernest Hemingway. This generation went through the turn of the century. They lived through World War I. They're called the Lost Generation. And it has to do with a lot of their ideals and things that they identified themselves were kind of stripped away from the horrors of World War I. And you see that in a lot of Ernest Hemingway writings like The Sun Also Rises, among other authors as well. A lot of authors came through this time period that are pretty famous for this sort of thing. So it makes sense. Gemini is the sign of writing, and that there would be powerful writers that come through this period. Pluto in Cancer happened from 1912 to 1939. And, it was this generation that went through World War I, or, were born around that time, or maybe afterwards, but they'd all gone through, most likely, the Great Depression, kind of Marxist. And it makes sense with Pluto and Cancer. Cancer is about home and security and feeling a collective threat about home security. Also, Cancer has to do with national identity, patriotism and pride. And you think about this time, there was the rise of fascism and Nazism and all that kind of stuff. Also, the communist revolution happened at this time in Russia. So, complete overthrow of the government, and, you know, everybody looking for a sense of security. Pluto and Leo happened from 1939 to 1958, and that marked a time, you know, during World War II and after World War II into the Cold War. And it was from this era that we got the silent generation and the baby boomers. The me generation kind of came in at this time, tail end of the silent generation. Anyways, the baby boomers and the me generation, it's all Pluto and Leo's about self-expression and finding the self. So the silent generation was about kind of fitting in and conforming, you know, silencing themselves. You know, the Red Scare had everyone's kind of afraid, you know, whether you were in a communist country, you're afraid to speak out against it, or in the U.S. where you're afraid to speak in favor of any kind of socialism or anything at that time, you know, because of the Red Scares. People were just taught to keep quiet and keep your head down and work hard. And the baby boomers was kind of a reaction to that. You know, it's through the baby boomers that a lot of and the silent generation, tail end of the silent generation, you get a lot of the hippie movement, you know, and the yuppies, and where people are trying to, you know, explore their own sense of self. Moving along here. Then as a reaction to the Pluto and Sun, you get the Pluto and Virgo. Those are kind of, that's the group that I belong to from 1958 to 1972. And sort of the end of the boomers and going into Generation X. You know, Pluto and Virgos had parents who were Pluto and Leos, who are very much into self-expression, and, you know, Pluto and Virgos, though, feel like they kind of had to do the work, or, you know, or didn't have as great of opportunities as the Pluto and Leo generation did. So a lot of feeling of kind of disillusionment, distrust of authority. You know, at this time was the Cold War in history. You know, during when Pluto was in Virgo, it was the civil rights movement. Virgo is about purity and segregation, and sort of transforming that idea of it, of keeping, you know, races separate. It was also the psychedelic era, the hippies, the sexual revolution. The birth control pill came out in this time period. So, you know, all those sort of things were part of the Pluto and Virgo era. Pluto and Libra came 1972 to 1984, was kind of a continuation of the Pluto and Virgo. You know, again, there was a Cold War, the sexual revolution, but also a development of personal computer technology. There was Nixon Watergate, all these things, kind of a disillusionment with the government at this time. And you get the tail end of the Generation X going into the millennials. So we're sort of entering the information age. But Libra is all about relationships and diplomacy. And you think at this time, the Cold War was at its height in terms of nuclear power, of mutual assured destruction. If there was ever a war between Russia and the U.S., it would annihilate all human beings. So it was about keeping balance, you know, of powers. So then you go into Pluto, and then also Libra is ruled by Venus, so the sexual revolution, you know, that took off as well, which kind of follows into Pluto and Scorpio, which was 1984 to 1995, and really was the height of the AIDS scare. Also, still into the Cold War, personal computers and, you know, became more ubiquitous. And then also the development of the World Wide Web and the internet came in at this time. So this was a very transformational time. So this marks the millennials and Generation Z, that was to come after the millennials. And then Pluto entered Sagittarius from 1995 to 2008, and I think of this time as kind of the world moving towards globalization with free trade agreements and everything, all our domestic manufacturing leaving the country, going to other places. It happened before this time period, but it really started to happen at this time period. And then also, you think of a collective threat. Sagittarius represents religion and cultural values, and so there's this and during this time was the 9/11 in 2001. So the start of the war on terror and the fear of fundamentalist religions. Also, fundamentalist ideals, ideologies, the Unabomber, those sort of things too. Any kind of terrorist act against the government, that sort of thing. And during this time was kind of the mark of Generation Z. And I don't really know who came after Generation Z, so that's why I have a question mark after it. But so then you got the Pluto and Capricorn generation, 2008 to 2024, the young, teenagers. I guess it would be teenagers now, wouldn't they? Or they're going into their early teens, and this marks the housing market collapse. So Capricorn's on the opposite side of Cancer. Cancer having to do with home, and so 2008 to 2024 is sort of the collective threat. Capricorn is sort of reminds me of corporate control. And it was during this time that we had Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, which was a protest against corporations and against the government. So that makes sense. It fits in with Pluto and Capricorn. Pluto in Aquarius in 2024, Elon Musk warns us about artificial intelligence, that maybe we should heed those threats that will, our technology, which is represented by Aquarius, will run ahead of us and, could be, it just makes me think of the movie Terminator and Skynet and the Matrix, maybe we'll have a UFO alien disclosure at this time. And I don't know what the generation will be called during that time. It hasn't happened yet. So anyways, it's really interesting to look at where Pluto moves through the signs and look at our generations. So now let's look at the outer four conjunctions. I mean, there's other aspects between the outer four that we look at when we look at charts. But the conjunctions are easy to mark. They only happen, they don't happen very often. And so let's take a look at those. Let's first start with Saturn conjunctions. Saturn to Uranus. Here is Saturn represents social order. Uranus represents social change. So at this time, you have the idea of making a new world order, which, is a buzzword for conspiracy theorists. It doesn't necessarily have to be a negative new world order. It's just a change in how things are organized. And you think about 1942 was the first time. This happens every 44 years. And I listed 2 years here. 1988 was the last one. 1942 was before that time. 1988, George Bush Sr. was running for president, and I think he used that in one of his speeches. He was going to create a new world order. 1942 was at the height of World War II, when we would be destroying, all these fascist governments and rebuilding them, rebuilding Germany, rebuilding Japan, and that sort of thing. So anyways, that's Saturn and Uranus. Saturn in let's see here, Saturn and Neptune. Saturn is a planet of, so that would be dissolving boundaries. Saturn has to do with order and structure, and Neptune is about consciousness, but also dissolving things. He was a sea god that created earthquakes and tidal waves. So what I find interesting is this date, you know, it happens every 36 years. And the last time it happened was in 1989, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, that separated communist Germany from Western Germany, and also the fall of all of the communist countries, fall of communism. So everything started to dissolve, and it happened again in 1953. So that's interesting. Another Saturn conjunction is Saturn and Pluto. This happens every 37 years. And we're due for another Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020, which should be interesting. I wonder what will happen. I'm not sure exactly what events happened in 1982, but what I found interesting was the date 1947 when there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which was the year of the UFO Roswell crash. And Saturn has to do with social order. Pluto has to do a lot with secrecy. So I kind of think of secret society, secret government, shadow government kind of stuff, because Saturn is about government and control, and Pluto is secrecy and transformation. And I think of this 1947 UFO Roswell crash, you know, that kind of technology, when that came here, you know, is a total game changer, you know, and how that was kept secret during this time. So let's look at the Uranus conjunctions. Uranus-Neptune, which has to do a lot with new technological consciousness, because Uranus is about technology, and Neptune is about awareness and consciousness. And this happens every 170 years. And what I find interesting is that there was a conjunction in 1993 when the first web browser came out to the market. So that gave people access to the internet. And just think how that transformed everybody's consciousness. And Uranus-Pluto has to do with social revolution, which happens every 140 years. And the last time it had that conjunction was in 1996, amidst the civil rights movements, when there were riots. It was in between the JFK assassination and the Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassination. So it was a time of complete social upheaval. And then if you look at the Neptune, let's look at Neptune-Pluto conjunction, which is what's left. This marks a total transformation of consciousness, because Neptune is about the collective unconscious and Pluto is about transformation. And this happens every 500 years. And the last time we had a Neptune-Pluto conjunction was in the 1890s, around the time that Freud's research was coming out about dreams and psychology. So the whole field of psychology kind of began around this time. This was also a mark in U.S. history of the progressive era, of trying to make changes in our society. It happened 500 years earlier, was the 1390s, which was around the time of the Italian Renaissance and Leonardo da Vinci, and how that transformed our consciousness. So I think it's very interesting to mark these conjunctions. However, you know, when we look at other people's charts, we're going to look at all their aspects, and that they're very similar to these conjunctions. The conjunctions, you know, don't happen as often, but, We're going to look at hard aspects such as squares and oppositions. These create more tension in the chart, and the soft aspects such as trines and sextiles will reduce or release tension in the chart. So it's interesting to see that. Our first chart example that we're going to look at is Allen Ginsberg, who is a beat poet, a political activist, and is kind of the godfather of counterculture, because he was a leader in the beatniks that preceded the hippies and all the other countercultures that followed after that. And so what I find interesting about him is that, his sun sign here is in Gemini, which, again has to do with writing and literature, and his Mercury is also in Gemini in its rulership. And so that's kind of what made him a poet, was ability to, his love of the written language, and that's what he was known for, mostly. And then he was also a double Pisces. He has a lot going on here in Pisces. He's a Pisces moon, as well as Pisces ascendant, which is really interesting. That makes Pisces is ruled by the planet Neptune over here, and so that becomes a very powerful planet for him. So his emotions, his moon's also in the 12th house, which is Piscean in nature. So that gives him a very sensitive emotional nature, highly, highly sensitive, intuitive, all of those things. And his ascendant, he has the appearance of someone who's very sensitive and kind of otherworldly. He gives off this otherworldly perception of himself. And so what I find interesting about that is that he's got a lot going on with Neptune here. Neptune, in terms of the outer four, Neptune is squared Saturn, which is a lot about dissolving the social order and the counterculture. He creating this new counterculture with Jack Kerouac and David Cassidy and different other beatnik poets, that kind of was different than the mainstream culture. So dissolving the order. Also, what's interesting is that he has a Uranus conjunct the ascendant, all in this Pisces here. So again, these are controlled by Neptune. Uranus is an outer planet that has to do with, change and alternative lifestyle. And so I think about him, he was one of the first public figures to incorporate being openly gay into his writings. I remember reading his some of his poetry and having those sort of themes, which that was before there was mainstream acceptance at that time. So, him living an alternative lifestyle and all of that, what made a huge impact in the culture because he was a public figure, and to this day is still highly revered as a poet. The second example I wanted to look at is David Cameron, who was the prime minister of the UK, the United Kingdom, England, and I picked his chart because of his Pluto-Uranus conjunct. He was born in 1966, which was right at that time of civil rights. And what's interesting is it's in his 12th house of the subconscious. So that spirit of that movement sort of works in his dreams, it's in the back of his mind. But what's interesting is that he's a conservative. He's a conservative party politician. So his politics kind of go against the revolution. You know, it's more social order. It's more of the Saturn. He's more of a Saturnian sort of fellow. At least in his, you know, that's how you kind of associate the Conservative Party here. So I find that really interesting that he was sort of born of that era of revolution. And so looking at his chart, you know, he's a double Libra. He's got both his sun in Libra and his ascendant in Libra. And the ruler of Libra is also, you know, near the sun, which is Venus. So they're very strong Libra, which has to do with diplomacy, you know, getting along with people. I could see how someone like him would, you know, get into government. He's a younger guy. I imagine he is somewhat good looking to a certain degree because Venus is about aesthetics. So kind of smoothing things over. His moon over here is in Leo. So a moon in Leo would have an emotional nature that's very expressive, self-expressive. And so also someone who's very proud in his upbringing. So we'd look at that too. And his moon is conjunct Jupiter, which has to do with mainstream culture as well. So, you know, you can see him having a big political presence as a politician. Now, so let's look at this Uranus-Pluto conjunction here that's opposite Saturn in Neptune, or Saturn in Pisces. So what's interesting about that is that, yeah, his conservative views or conservative politics are in opposition to what is in the back of his mind, what's in his subconscious, which is this social change and revolution. You know, so there's this kind of push and pull between these two forces, you know, like a tug of war of sorts. And my intuition about him was that he was kind of someone who, being a Libra, was able to smooth out some of the conflict between maybe the progressive and some of the more, the conservative and some of the more liberal or progressive parts of the party. What's interesting also is that his Saturn in Pisces is ruled by Neptune, which is trine to Saturn, and also sextile to that conjunction between Pluto and Uranus. And so his Neptune's in Scorpio, which again has to do with your, your kind of intuition, spirituality, collective unconscious. So that influenced him in terms of his politics as well. So I see a strong, compassionate theme in him, but perhaps he had to do it. Perhaps he was someone who had to work inside the system, inside the conservative order, to kind of help, or do some of the things to help the common people, or to help with the social changes that happened at the time of his birth. Probably people have mixed opinions of him, or, especially if you're liberal or progressive or more left-wing, feel like maybe he's more of the enemy. But it's funny when you look at his chart, because he has such a predominant Neptune there, that it would give him some compassion. And there's that kind of revolutionary spirit, but it's in the back of his unconscious. Yet he has that moon in Leo that gives him a certain proud sort of, I did it all by myself. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, kind of the certain conservative emblems that you see with them. But yet within him is a certain compassionate thread. And there's also this kind of peacemaker part of him, the part of him that knows how to be diplomatic and how to get along with different types of people. So I don't really know much about David Cameron. I haven't followed his political career. I'm just looking at his chart. I'd be interested to hear what people think of him, or, you know, more familiar with him in the comments if you have any. Anyways, what do we take away from this this video? Is that, you know, we looked at the big three and the outer four. The big three have to do with quick changing parts of our chart because they move so quickly. They change from hour to hour. They define our individuality, who we are as individuals. The outer four planets are slow changing and have to do with our generation and kind of effects on our generation. So when you look at our big three and outer four together, you know, you see how you kind of fit into the big picture, you know, and that's what we're looking at. That's why we want to put the two together. Just looking at your personality or individuality only gives you half the story. It's how do you fit in to, you know, where do you fit in your generation, you know, in the generations that happen before you in your family, and in the generations that are going to come through with your children if you have children. So it's just something to think about. It's a nice place to start. So this is just the start of the reading. I mean, we spent some time describing the big three and the outer four. But I mean, let's review some of the things we got to think about before we even give a reading. Is that we need to think about a person's age and their stage in life. Are you giving this reading to a young child? Or are you giving it to an elder? You know, if you're giving this a reading for a young child, you know, you got to be careful what you say. You know, you don't want to talk too much about relationships or struggles or things like that they would encounter later in life, because that's not really what their parents want to know. They want to know what will be their interests, their strengths, you know, what's their schooling going to be like, what kind of friends are they going to have. You know, you don't want to delve too much into adult subjects. Also, when you're talking to an elder, you don't want to talk to them like they're 20 years old and they haven't been around the block a few times, because they know what they like. They've already had their career, you know, their relationships. What you want to look at is what's going to be their legacy. What are they passing down to future generations? That sort of thing. And so that's an important thing to take away. Another thing to take away is when you start off, you know, to keep it light, you know, with the sun, moon, and ascendant and rising, and talk about their generation, you know, and then you add more layers of depth as you go along in the reading. But it's just kind of a starting place to get them oriented with the chart. So you don't want to spend too much time on it, you know, especially, I mean, a typical chart reading I do is an hour long. You know, you got to think about people's attention spans. Of course, people are more attentive when you're talking about them than the dry subject. But still, you don't want to spend too much time on it because there's a lot more to cover. And we will talk about those things in the following video of what we're going to cover next. Thank you very much.